Find the derivative of y equals h of g of f of x, then evaluate y prime of negative 1, where we have all that information there. Y here is the double composition of functions. It has h of g of f of x. Now, while we don't know what f and g and h are here, we know that f is inside of g and is inside of h, and therefore we have a double composition which would lead to a double chain rule for the derivative. The derivative y prime, or dy dx, will be found by taking the derivative of the outermost function first, h prime, leaving its inside alone, so g of f of x. And then we multiply by the derivative of that inside. Now the next inner function is g. We take the derivative of that. We will call that g prime. We will leave its inside alone. And then we finish with the derivative of that inside, and that's the second chain rule. That'll be called f prime of x. That's why we have a double chain rule there. There's our derivative y prime, or dy dx. The next thing to do is evaluate y prime of negative 1. And that means to plug in negative 1 into each of the x's here. So we will have h prime of g of f of negative 1 times g prime of f of negative 1 times f prime of negative 1. Now we're going to look those up from our values given. This will be h prime of g of f of negative 1. That would be up here. That'll be a negative 2. And that means, likewise here, it'll be a negative 2. That's another f of negative 1. Now we need an f prime of negative 1 to multiply it at the end there. And f prime of negative 1, that's down here. That's actually a negative 4. So this will be a negative 4 down here. So y prime of negative 1 will equal h prime of g of negative 2. Now g of negative 2 is right here. It's actually a 0. So we have h prime of 0 for that. And then we have that times g prime of negative 2. Now g prime of negative 2 is right here. It's a negative 1. And then times a negative 4. And then we can finally replace in a value of h prime of 0. That's the very last one given. It's down here. That's actually a 6. So we have a 6 times a negative 1 times a negative 4. Negative 1 times negative 4 is a positive 4. We can maybe multiply those. And then 6 times 4, which will give us a 24.